Sometimes, history doesn't change with explosions or revolutions. Sometimes, it changes with a signature, a single choice made in a quiet office on an ordinary day. No crowds, no cameras, no sense that billions of dollars are about to be lost. Tonight's story begins with one such moment, a decision that looked harmless at the time, reasonable even. But years later, it would cost America billions and reshape an entire industry. The setting is unremarkable. A conference room in Washington, fluorescent lights, coffee cups on the table, stacks of briefing papers filled with technical language that few outside the room would ever read. The people inside are not villains. They are policymakers, economists, advisors, people tasked with solving an urgent problem under pressure. The nation is facing a growing challenge, rising costs, public frustration, and a system that seems outdated. Something has to change. The public demands efficiency, businesses demand clarity, political leaders demand results before the next election cycle. The proposal on the table is framed as reform: streamline regulations, cut red tape, encourage competition, save money. On paper, it looks like a win for everyone. Supporters argue that the change will unlock innovation, reduce government spending, and let the free market do what it does best: optimize. Opponents raise concerns. They warn that removing certain safeguards could create long-term vulnerabilities, that short-term savings might mask long-term costs, that complex systems don't always respond well to simple solutions. But the pressure to act is strong. The economy is under strain, headlines are turning critical. Doing nothing feels riskier than trying something new. And so, the decision is made. A policy change passes quietly. A regulation is relaxed. A rule that once protected stability is rewritten in the name of efficiency. At first, the results seem positive. Budgets tighten, costs dip, reports highlight early gains. Politicians point to the numbers and call it progress. But systems are patient. They don't fail immediately. They absorb stress, they adjust, and then, slowly, they begin to reveal the cracks. Within a few years, unintended consequences surface. Companies learn to exploit loopholes that didn't exist before. Short-term profit becomes the dominant strategy, while long-term stability fades into the background. Incentives shift in subtle ways, rewarding behavior that looks efficient on spreadsheets, but fragile in reality. Oversight agencies, now leaner and less empowered, struggle to keep pace with rapidly changing markets. The guardrails that once prevented reckless behavior are thinner. Risk accumulates, but it remains largely invisible. To the public, things appear normal. The economy grows, markets fluctuate as they always have. The early warning signs are buried in technical reports, footnotes, and internal memos that never make the evening news. Inside boardrooms, however, a different conversation unfolds. Executives push boundaries, investors chase returns, complex financial products grow more opaque. The system becomes more profitable and more fragile at the same time. This is the paradox of the decision. By making the system more efficient, it removed friction that once slowed dangerous behavior. Speed increased, volume increased, complexity increased, and with complexity came hidden risk. Then the first tremors: a small failure here, a sudden loss there. A company collapses under pressure that regulators no longer have the tools to manage. Still, leaders reassure the public. These are isolated incidents. The fundamentals are strong. There is no cause for concern. History tells us that these words often appear just before the bill comes due. Because when safeguards are removed, consequences don't arrive as warnings. They arrive as invoices. The costs begin to surface in unexpected places: bailouts, emergency interventions, taxpayer-funded rescues.
Programs that were meant to save money now require massive spending to prevent collapse. Billions flow not into growth, but into damage control. The very decision that promised efficiency becomes the source of extraordinary expense. And yet, the origin of the problem remains obscure to most people. They feel the consequences: job losses, market instability, rising public debt, but they don't see the quiet policy choice that set the stage years earlier. This is how a single choice costs a nation billions, not in one dramatic moment, but through a chain reaction of incentives, behaviors, and unintended consequences. In the next part, we'll trace that chain more closely, uncovering how the decision reshaped incentives, who benefited in the short term, and why the long-term cost was always there, waiting to be paid. Because in policy, the most expensive mistakes are rarely the loud ones. They're the quiet ones we don't notice until it's too late.
Every system runs on incentives. Change the rules and you change behavior. That's the part no one likes to admit when reforms are announced. Policies are written with intentions, but people respond to rewards. And when rewards change, outcomes follow, whether leaders planned for them or not. After the decision was made, a quiet shift began. Regulations that once slowed certain activities were loosened. Oversight that once forced caution became advisory rather than authoritative. Barriers to entry were lowered, and new players rushed in, eager to capitalize on what looked like opportunity. At first, competition surged. Prices dipped, innovation accelerated, quarterly profits climbed. From the outside, it looked like the reform was working. But inside the system, something else was happening. Risk was being repriced. Activities that once carried consequences now carried rewards. Complex strategies that generated short-term gains became attractive, even if they introduced long-term instability. The market began to favor speed over safety, volume over verification. In boardrooms and trading floors, a new logic took hold. If the rules allow it, we'd be foolish not to use it. This is how incentive structures quietly redefine ethics. No one needs to be malicious, they only need to be rational within the new rules. As competition intensified, firms that remained cautious fell behind. Those that embraced aggressive strategies surged ahead. The market rewarded boldness, not restraint. Over time, this created pressure to conform. Caution looked like weakness. Prudence looked like missed opportunity. And so the system drifted toward fragility. Behind the scenes, oversight agencies tried to adapt. Analysts raised concerns about growing complexity, interconnected risks, and the concentration of exposure in places few fully understood. But their authority had been trimmed by the very reform that promised efficiency. Warnings became recommendations. Recommendations became memos. Memos became background noise. The structure of accountability had shifted. The result was a widening gap between how risky the system actually was and how risky it appeared to be. To the public, the economy seemed healthy. To insiders, it felt stretched. Then came the first real shock. A failure in one corner of the system rippled outward. Because safeguards had been loosened, the shock traveled faster and farther than expected. What should have been a contained incident became a chain reaction. Markets trembled, liquidity dried up, confidence wavered. Emergency meetings were called. This time, not to cut red tape, but to manage fallout. Leaders who once praised the reform now faced a different set of choices. Let the system correct itself and risk widespread damage, or intervene and absorb the cost. Intervention won, because letting the system fail would have meant catastrophic consequences, job losses, collapsed institutions, and economic shockwaves that would reach far beyond balance sheets. So the government stepped in. Funds were allocated, guarantees were issued, rescue programs were launched.
The price tag climbed into the billions. And here's the irony. The reform that was meant to reduce government spending now required massive public expenditure to prevent collapse. Taxpayers, who had little say in the original decision, now bore the cost of its consequences. This is how incentives turn against the public. When private gains are protected and public losses are socialized, the system encourages risk-taking without full accountability. The rewards remain private, the costs become collective. In the aftermath, investigations begin. Committees ask what went wrong. Reports are written. Hearings are held. The language is technical and the blame diffuse. No single villain emerges, because the problem wasn't a person, it was a structure. A set of incentives that nudged rational actors toward collectively irrational outcomes. And that structure traced back to the single choice made years earlier. The choice to prioritize efficiency over resilience, speed over safeguards, short-term savings over long-term stability. By the time the consequences are fully understood, the system is already deeply intertwined with those incentives. Undoing them would mean confronting powerful interests, admitting costly mistakes, and redesigning complex frameworks from the ground up. That kind of reform is politically difficult. So adjustments are made, but the core architecture remains. The nation absorbs the cost and moves on. In the next part, we'll follow the money. Who benefited from the decision before it backfired? Who paid when it failed? And why these outcomes repeat across history. Because when incentives are misaligned, the bill is never paid by those who wrote the rules. It's paid by everyone else.
Follow the money. It's the oldest rule in understanding power. When a decision reshapes a system, the first question isn't what changed, it's who gained from the change. Because while the public narrative focused on efficiency and growth, the financial reality told a different story. In the early years after the decision, a small group of institutions and insiders saw unprecedented gains. Stock prices surged, bonuses ballooned, executive compensation reached historic highs. For those positioned at the top of the system, the new rules weren't just helpful, they were transformative. With fewer constraints and greater flexibility, profits could be scaled quickly. Strategies that once would have raised red flags were now celebrated as innovative. The winners were visible in annual reports and luxury headlines. The costs, however, were hidden. They appeared slowly, in layoffs, in shrinking public services, in communities hollowed out by economic shock. When instability rippled through the system, businesses that depended on stable credit faltered. Small enterprises closed their doors. Workers lost jobs they had relied on for decades. The impact wasn't evenly distributed. Those with diversified assets and political access weathered the storm. Those living paycheck to paycheck felt the shock immediately. Savings evaporated. Homes were foreclosed. Entire neighborhoods saw their economic foundations crumble. This is how structural decisions create unequal outcomes. The same policy that accelerates wealth at the top can destabilize the base that supports the entire economy. But because the gains and losses are separated by layers of institutions and time, the connection is rarely obvious. When the crisis peaked, public funds were used to stabilize the system. Bailouts were framed as necessary to prevent total collapse. And in a narrow sense, they worked. Markets calmed. Institutions survived. The immediate panic subsided. But the moral ledger told a harsher story. Losses were absorbed by the public. Profits remained private. This imbalance reshaped public trust. For many Americans, it felt like the system had chosen sides, and it hadn't chosen them. Faith in institutions eroded. Confidence in leadership waned.
The idea that the rules applied equally began to sound hollow. Meanwhile, those who had benefited from the original decision emerged largely intact. Some faced scrutiny, few faced lasting consequences. The structure that rewarded risk-taking remained mostly in place. Reforms were proposed, but many were diluted in negotiation. The system adapted, just enough to survive, without fundamentally changing the incentive framework that caused the damage. This is how cycles persist. A decision creates a structure. The structure shapes behavior. The behavior produces outcomes, and when outcomes turn destructive, the system absorbs the shock without fully changing. The public narrative often frames these moments as unfortunate accidents, complex failures no one could have predicted. But complexity doesn't erase responsibility. The warning signs were present. Analysts had raised concerns. History offered precedents. The difference was political will. Admitting the cost of the original choice would have meant acknowledging that billions were lost not to chance, but to design, that the system behaved exactly as it was structured to behave. And that's a difficult truth to sell. So the story becomes abstract. Market forces, unforeseen circumstances, external shocks, language that diffuses accountability. But for families who lost homes, for workers who lost stability, the story was anything but abstract. It was personal. It was tangible. It was a reminder that decisions made far from their lives could still determine their outcomes. In the years that followed, the economy recovered on paper. Numbers improved. Growth returned. Headlines spoke of resilience. Yet beneath the surface, the distribution of risk and reward had changed permanently. Wealth concentration intensified. Safety nets were thinner. The memory of vulnerability lingered. And perhaps the most lasting consequence was psychological, a subtle shift in how people viewed the future. Trust in long-term stability gave way to short-term caution. The belief that hard work alone could secure security weakened. The sense that the system would protect the average citizen felt uncertain. All from a single choice. In the final part, we'll zoom out. We'll look at the lesson this decision leaves behind, why nations repeat these patterns, why leaders favor short-term wins over long-term resilience, and what this story reveals about the true cost of decisions made in quiet rooms. Because history doesn't just record what happened, it records what we chose to value.
History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. Every generation believes its challenges are unique, more complex, more unprecedented, more difficult than anything before. New technology, faster markets, global interdependence, all of it creates the feeling that the past has little to teach us. And yet, the pattern remains the same. A moment of pressure, a promise of efficiency, a decision that trades long-term stability for short-term gain. It rarely feels reckless at the time. Leaders face deadlines, political capital is finite, crises demand fast action. In those moments, choices are framed not as ideal versus flawed, but as action versus inaction. The safer path often appears slow, expensive, and unpopular. The risky path promises speed, savings, and applause. So the risky path wins, not because leaders are evil, but because incentives shape courage. Short-term success is visible, long-term failure is abstract. When the consequences don't arrive until years later, accountability fades. New leaders inherit old structures. The architects of the decision move on to new offices, new careers, new chapters of influence. The system remains. And so the lesson history teaches is subtle but brutal. We don't just live with the consequences of our choices. We live inside the systems our choices create. Once incentives are locked in, behavior follows.
markets adapt. Institutions normalize risk. What once felt like an exception becomes routine, and over time, the extraordinary becomes invisible, until the bill comes due. When it does, the response is almost always reactive. Emergency measures, public funds, reassurances of reform. But true reform is slow. It requires undoing layers of structure built over years. It demands confronting powerful interests that benefit from the status quo. It means admitting that what once looked like progress was in fact a vulnerability. That's hard to do. So the cycle continues. A new crisis emerges. A new decision promises relief. The same trade-off appears in a new form. Efficiency over resilience, speed over safeguards, convenience over consequence. The story you've just heard isn't unique to one moment in American history. It's a case study in how modern systems, financial, political, technological, are shaped by choices made under pressure. And it raises a quiet question. What decisions are being made right now that we won't fully understand for another decade? What structures are being built today that future generations will inherit, along with their hidden costs? The most powerful decisions are rarely the loudest ones. They don't always come with dramatic speeches or historic announcements. Sometimes they're buried in policy language, regulatory changes, or budgetary footnotes. They shape the invisible architecture of society. And because they're invisible, they're rarely debated by the people who will live with their consequences. This is the true cost of decisions made in quiet rooms. Not just billions of dollars, but billions of trust, billions of stability, billions of futures quietly reshaped. If there's one lesson to carry forward, it's this. Resilience is expensive, but fragility is catastrophic. Systems built for speed will eventually break under pressure. Systems built for stability bend, but survive. The difference isn't dramatic in the short term. It only becomes clear when stress arrives. And stress always arrives. So the next time you hear about a necessary reform or a temporary measure, remember the story behind this single choice that cost America billions. Remember that the true impact of decisions isn't measured by headlines today, but by the lives shaped years from now. History doesn't judge us by our intentions. It judges us by the systems we leave behind.